Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 131 of our regular shows, and we're recording this podcast on May 8th, 2016. I suppose you could say this is kind of going to be a little bit of a special podcast in that this is going to be our kind of review show for the Korra 2016 free comic, which is called Friends for Life, because Free Comic Book Day was yesterday, May 7th. But this is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me is just one other host on the podcast this week, and that is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, we've got a pretty basic show this week because the only news really is Free Comic Book Day and the fact that this free core comic is out. So we'll just get that review out of the way. We'll answer a couple of listener questions at the end, and that'll be the show for this week. So let's just get straight into Free Comic Book Day. Greg didn't attend the event. I did. My experience was basically that I woke up at about 7, immediately kind of left. Got to my local comic book store at around 7:30 to join the queue, and there was about, I'd say, 35 to 40 people already in the queue by the time I arrived there, and the store didn't open until 9. So it was a good an hour and a half wait. And the worst thing about it was that, like, all week the weather forecast was that Sunday was basically meant to be the hottest day in Ireland for years, but it was lashing rain. So it was a lot of rain for an hour and a half. Luckily, it wasn't super heavy rain, so it wasn't too bad. But this year was the first year that my local comic book store was doing Free Comic Book Day in their new premises, which they kind of got into a couple of months back. So once they did open, the line went through so much quicker than it did the last couple of years, because before, the way they had to do it was that, like, they could only let about 5 people into the store at once because it was so small. This time, though, the place they have is so much bigger, and they could basically let like 20, 30 people in at once, and they just had all of the free comics stacked up at a really long table, and they had the queue go all the way up one side of the table, around the back, and then all the way up the other side, and there were people with bags to put your free comics in, so it was like super well organized. You could just pick out the comics you wanted, and obviously then buy stuff in the store if you wanted before you left. So it was really actually easy this year compared to other years, because once it hit 9, I was basically in the store within like 5 minutes and picked up the core comic and a couple of the other ones I wanted, and that was about it. And then just got home, reviewed the comic, read it, reviewed it, posted images up on the site for other people to read. But I suppose how did Free Comic Book Day go for you in terms of like when did you first see the comic go up online and stuff like that?
Probably around, I think, 11 or so. Actually, I saw your actual review on YouTube first, but I didn't watch it or anything. I wanted to wait to actually read the comic. So then I put up the comic. I think I saw it on Tumblr's where I found it. So I read it up there, and then I just checked out some of the other threads to see what people were saying about it, because it seemed like some people were actually having a hard time actually getting it here in the States. So that was interesting to see. But yeah, no, it was pretty straightforward for me since I just waited for it to come online.
Yeah, in terms of the amount of the core free comic they had, it was interesting because obviously they just had the stack of each individual comic separate on a giant table. So, like, they looked like they had at the start like around in or around 100 or so copies of the book. Obviously, I didn't count, but it looked like that. It was after about like 30 or 40 people walked by, there was still a huge stack left. So, if you didn't go in any way early, I assume you wouldn't get it. And that it seemed like they were relatively low on most of the comics by around like 2 or 3. I was roughly following it on Twitter, what they were saying. But yeah, I definitely noticed a lot of people from America saying that they just couldn't get the comic. But that's definitely like something we said in terms of advice, like go as early as possible to guarantee you get yourself this comic if you want a physical copy. Otherwise, like I think there are already there before people were getting this comic early from eBay. That's the preview pages we talked about last time around, where that someone ordered early from eBay and it shipped early. So people were sending it out already, and there'll still be copies available. And it's probably best to try and get it as early as close to the event as possible if you want to get it, because otherwise it could go off eBay for a while. I think that tends to happen with like the 2013 and 14 ones, that you see one or two listings, they might go away and come back at some other point. So it's a it's definitely an interesting one. Definitely we've obviously talked about the like that we really wish they would like make some sort of collection that includes all of the free comics, so that people can actually buy all of them, rather than just hoping that like 4 years in a row they got lucky and got the four free comics. I'm now like 50% success, 50% failure with the free comics. I have this one and then the 2014 one, Shells. But yeah, that's enough kind of setup for this. So let's get straight into the review for the first ever Legend of Korra comic, the 2016 Dark Horse All Ages book, which the core story is titled Friends for Life. It's 10 pages long. Our creative team is script by Michael Dante DiMartino, co-creator of Avatar, of course, art by Heather Campbell, colors by Vivian Ng. I think I pronounced that correctly, and lettering, of course, by Michael Heisler. So yeah, we'll quickly start off with general thoughts, because we're going to after this get into the book, going through it page by page, and I'll explain how you can follow along with us in just a second. But overall, Greg, what were your thoughts on this 10-page free comic?
I thought it was pretty good. I mean, it's pretty sweet. It's pretty cute. It has it's a pretty self-contained story, which I like. So it doesn't have any sort of it's sort of the speculative framing elements that we thought it might have had as far as referencing the larger story overall. But I thought it worked pretty well for just telling the story of how Korra got Naga, and I guess a little bit of her early training in waterbending.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I feel about it. It is a very cute story, but a very important story as well. In that, just knowing how Korra met Naga, we sort of knew it because obviously we had the really basic description of the story from the art book, but actually seeing the story told here, it's nothing overly complicated that needed like months of setup or anything like that. It was just, these 10 pages covered exactly all that it needed to be, and gave us a little insight into a time period in Korra's life that we only know little bits about. Just like very early on, what was it like? Order of White Lotus presence, how was the Avatar compound, who were the earliest people involved in her training, and so on. And it hits on that. It has some serious elements to it, in that there are hints to, I suppose, issues that will later develop in Korra's life with regards to like the rules of the Order of White Lotus and stuff like that. But overall, I think this is a very successful free comic. I, in my review, written review on the site and on YouTube, mentioned that for me, this is the best of the four core free comic Avatar free comics we've got so far. Where would you rate this among the other three, Rebound, Shells,
Hmm.
and Sisters?
That's a good one. I mean, out of most of them, I mean, I would probably go with this one only because it fits more in line of the actual story, and it's more
Mhm.
content that we don't know and that we kind of more so want. And I don't know, maybe because I like Korra more, that it sort of sticks out to me as far as the story goes overall. But for me, it seems to generally have more. I don't know, more importance in the whole overall story and the building of the actual world. I mean, it is nice to know, the side stories about, what Tylee and Toph and Sakansuki and our other characters like Mai are sort of doing. But this one seems, I don't know, for the most interesting, and it's something that we know a little bit about, but it's nice to get sort of the full picture, and it works pretty well.
Yeah, my ranking for them is kind of like, okay, the core one I think is the best. Second, I'd say Rebound, because like this one, it's important to the plot, and that
Mhm.
how Korra and Naga met is important. That's something we needed to know, I suppose, at some point. And then with Rebound, that's actually like kind of, I suppose, retroactively back in 2013. Maybe we didn't think it meant as much, but now it was this really interesting middle ground between the promise and Zuko and May's breakup, and Smoke and Shadow, and the potential for them to get back together. So that one became all the more important. Shells is good. It has that little bit about the Kyoshi warriors and some of the origins there and what Kyoshi did, which is nice. But in terms of like Sokka and Suki, it's just a kind of very simple story that doesn't have a lot of impact beyond it's cool to see Sokka and Suki together again. And then last year's comic Sisters is like another cool thing in that, okay, we're introduced to Ty Lee's sisters and adding a little bit to her story from the show, but the whole Toph Ty Lee dynamic wasn't as, I suppose, interesting as we perhaps thought. So I think this one is probably the best like overall balance overall. Um, but yeah, let's get into going through this page by page. Like Greg, a lot of people online just for whatever reason couldn't or didn't want to go to Free Comic Book Day, and there are scans, images available all over the place. Basically, if you go on Tumblr, you'll find multiple places. For us, the easiest way I can say is just go to Avatar: The Last Airbender online.com, obviously the site we do this podcast for. And I suppose by the time this podcast is live, it'll be the second newest news post up on the site. The post is called like a 2016 Korra Free Comic Friends for Life Scans and Review, and that features all 10 pages. The pictures are just enough quality to where you can like see everything clearly and read the pages. I'm not going to say they're amazing pictures or anything like that, but you can follow along with us there or find higher quality images elsewhere and read along with us. But yeah, let's start off with Friends for Life. So we open up with little Korra practicing waterbending with Katara as Tonraq and Senna look on. And Katara says, "Now watch me, Korra. Waterbending is all about slow, calm movements." But when Korra goes to actually put this into practice, she does more of a kind of earthbending, firebending style of move, and basically creates a small-scale snow avalanche and kind of engulfs Katara in it. And Korra's like, "Pretty good, huh?" As Tonraq and Senna run out to help the fallen Katara and say, "Not again," and Senna just is like, "Katara." And then Senna does go over to her and says, "I'm so sorry, Korra doesn't seem to know her own strength." But Katara just responds. She gets up and says, "It's all right. I've battled more dangerous waterbenders than her. She'll learn to control her power in time." So what are your thoughts on this first page?
Yeah, this is pretty cool. I mean, this is sort of what we got as the unofficial preview, but it's nice to see the full thing in this sort of full context. So I thought this was pretty cool. Just I don't know. I mean, it really speaks to Korra and just her from what we know of her being, younger and just being sort of brash and sort of, using her abilities to the full strength and not really having, sort of the full control over it yet. So it's nice to see sort of where she sort of began to see, where she ends up later on. So it's a nice, point of reference of that, and it's always cool to see older Katara in any sort of context here. So it's cool to see her that she was sort of the first one to train Korra, which we pretty much already knew.
Yeah, I think for me it's interesting that they just straight up open right in the flashback. Like we're just covering Korra at an earlier point in her life. It's not older Korra telling a story and like bringing us into this thing. It's just no, we're getting this point in her life, and that's pretty interesting. And I think just from the look of Korra here, it's very clear that this is days, if not at the most, I would say weeks after the initial discovery of the Order of White Lotus. Tonraq and Senna contacting the White Lotus and telling them that their daughter's the Avatar, because you can see that there are some tents set up in the background. It looks like they just planted a tower in a snow embankment nearby, and that's all the Avatar compound is right now. It's kind of not really a compound. It's just like Avatar training is going on here. We're going to have a little bit of a lookout. And it's clear that Korra is being trained very close to her own house. So her parents are right there involved. They're watching on, and there's some nice character stuff. You can tell it's written by one of the show creators, because Korra is really just an extension of that one scene we got in episode 1. She's like, "I'm the Avatar. I'm awesome. I'm really cool." And her design, as I said, is cool. It's just her from that first episode, but with smaller versions of her, Ugg boots, which is quite cute. And The other thing I'll just mention is Katara mentions waterbending, slow, calm movements, and then we all know Korra, especially early on, those two things don't describe her at all. She's kind of the exact opposite, fast and a bit brash. And I like how she's kind of proud that she just like engulfed Katara in snow and stuff like that. And her parents are just like, "We're so sorry she's like this," to Katara, but she's used to it. And um, uh, in terms of her battling more dangerous waterbenders, do you think she's talking about someone in particular there, or is it just in general?
I would think it's probably just more so in general. I don't think they're really trying to key us in on any sort of specific,
Yeah.
strong waterbender. But I don't know. I think it's a cool reference. I mean, you can think back to all the different, benders that Katara's fought that we know of, and that maybe she's fought of even more after the fact. So it's cool. It's a nice nod.
Yeah. Like I assume it's like if she, in terms of the people she's probably thinking about saying, and it's probably like Paku, Hama, the people who actually like hit her, I suppose, that actually like managed to kind of hurt her in her own journey. But we move on to page 2, and we get a continuation of this scene. Tonrock goes over to Korra and says, "Korra, that was too rough. You could have really hurt Master Katara." Korra replies saying, "I didn't mean to," and Tonrock just says, "I know," and he kind of trails off as he looks over and sees a storm heading right over to their house. Basically, he says, looks like we'll have to cut training short. Storm's heading our way," and Korra is very sad about this. She's just like, "Oh," and she just waves goodbye to Katara, saying, "Bye, Master Katara. Sorry for beating you up." And Katara leaves, saying, "Haha, that's quite all right. See you tomorrow, Korra." As basically a howl kind of comes out. Ow is the sound effect that we get, and it's clear that there are polar bear dogs nearby. And it's interesting here because Tonrock and Senna are both very kind of, I suppose, a little bit fearful about this. They're like, polar bear dogs sounds like a whole pack. Korra just wants to play. She says, "But Daddy, I want to go and play with them." And Tonrock says, "You can't, sweetie. Polar bear dogs are wild animals. They'd gobble you up in one bite." And she says, "They don't scare me." And Senna says, "They should." So, what are your thoughts on page 2?
Yeah, no, this is real interesting. I don't know. I think it's interesting just Senna's remark on Korra being so fearless at this, sort of young age, which I guess, at this point Korra really hasn't had too much to sort of actually be sort of fearful at this point, especially now that she's, been discovered as the Avatar. She's, pretty much will be or is already protected by a lot of people. So, I guess this just really puts you in the context of Korra's sort of attitude as a young sort of child here. I mean, you can even see her sort of calling back out to the pack while
Mm,
they first sort of make their noise. So it's interesting just to see that and just to get I guess get more context of how I guess sort of fearful we know of polar bear dogs, since we know from before that they're pretty wild animals, but you can get sort of a little bit of a different sort of sense of how sort of fearful they are, and the fact that Tyrox says that they'll sort of swallow Korra up in one full bite, which could be possible, I guess.
mm. Yeah, it's a really interesting one that there's a few things they kind of reference here, just like that Korra is very powerful for her age. She's only like 5 or so here, and Tonrock just saying that, look, you're strong, but that was very rough. You could have actually hurt her there, and you can see that she's just not fully used to having bending, and I suppose how to like not have it be just 100% when she does it. Like do the slow calm movements and just move it rather than like really like shift it every all over the place. Um, and just little moments that really show that they're really good at characterizing a younger Korra, like saying sorry for beating you up, and she's so like that was a cool thing I just did there. Sorry about it. Katara being like perfectly fine with that because she's like she knows what kids are like. She has three of her own and stuff like that. And like you said, I think we knew before, like primarily I think just from like Mike and Brian saying stuff like outside of the show, that polar bear dogs are very much considered like these predatory animals around the water tribes, and they're dangerous, like to the point where like they're like if you hunt one of them, like it's a kind of crazy thing if you manage to get one. And you can see here that even Tonrock and Senna are like very much like this is a big thing if there's a pack of polar bear dogs around here. And as you say, she's very fearless here, just with her calling out to them and saying that they don't scare her, and she wants to play with them. So, um, especially with play being kind of bolded, I definitely got the idea of like, this is her slight connection to Aang with like wanting to play with animals, kind of type thing. Doesn't probably mean a lot, but I just like that little moment. Um, Next page doesn't have any dialogue. It's just four panels of first of all, little Korra in bed, basically looking over at her parents who are also asleep. I suppose it gives you a look at the layout of their house, and that Tonraq and Senna have their kind of double bed on one side of the room, and then Korra has her small bed on kind of right opposite them. So it's a small, simple house that they live in, and Korra sneaks out, puts her winter coat on, and kind of climbs into the tundra nearby, basically searching for these polar bear dogs she wants to play with. So she's continuing to kind of respond to their kind of howls with her own. So any thoughts on this interesting choice to have just completely no dialogue panel?
Yeah, no, I think it works pretty well since it's setting up the whole idea that, everyone's sort of asleep, everything's sort of calm, and Cora's really sort of, clearly she hasn't forgotten about the polar bear dogs, the call from earlier. So, this pretty much fits really in sort of context with what we know of Cora, especially at like a younger age when she's definitely a bit more sort of, I guess, rebellious. So it's definitely kind of cool just to see her sort of, go on her own sort of mini adventure in this story.
Yeah, and I suppose it highlights here that there are not many rules really around her training here, in that she can just walk out of her own house and straight into the kind of wilderness. Basically, there's really no one watching her, and like really kind of afraid for her security overall. But next page, she's looking around and sees a polar bear dog pup, and is really happy to see this. But she's really incredible reaction when she sees this, and she says, "You're just a pup. Where's your pack? Are you lost? I'm not going to hurt you. I'm friendly." As she pulls out a bit of fish jerky, and she says, "Do you like fish jerky?" and like offers it to this little polar bear dog pup, and she just says, a little closer, and it begins to eat it, and she says, "You're not so scary. You're just hungry." And then Core gets down on all fours and begins to kind of, like a dog, kind of run around this little polar bear dog pup, saying, "Woof, woof, come on, don't you want to play?" Then she realizes, as a kind of the storm has properly come in now, she has no idea which way to go back to home, and is like, "Oh, which way is home?" And she says, "I think we're both lost now," as like she doesn't really want to move away from the dog, which is the only living thing in the area. So just over the course of like these 2 pages, she kind of gets herself lost, but has formed a little bit of a friendship with this lost polar bear dog. So what are your thoughts on basically the meeting moment here that we get?
Yeah, no, I thought this was really nice. It's really cute how they sort of set this up, how Cora just happens to have some fish jerky in her pocket, and that sort of is what, brings her to sort of Naga, since, that's pretty typical as far as, creatures always being able to eat food, and then they sort of, you can befriend them at that point. So it was nice how they set it up here. And even it's funny just seeing Cora sort of try to get her to play with her by actually running around like a dog herself, which is kind of nice to see. But yeah, no, it's interesting just to see how Cora sort of, she's so excited in the beginning here, and then she, at the end of it, she sort of realizes that she doesn't really know where she's at, and sort of has lost her bearings.
Definitely. It's really really interesting when there's a lot of nice art over here, as you see like Cora in a new outfit, with the kind of winter coat on, and she just happens to bring the food with her. You sort of wonder, like, did she know that this is the sort of thing that polar bear dogs like to eat, or was this just like something she saved up and that she didn't eat for her dinner or something like that, knowing that she was going to go out. Um, I don't know if they were trying to go for a reference here, but obviously there was a couple of jokes in Korra the show about Korra Naga doing something really important for Korra, but Korra not having a treat for Naga to like reward her for doing something good, and like usually it would be something like this. So I don't know if you got the same impression. Like I think there was a joke with like Lin or something like that, where Lin fed Naga once, and then Korra, she did something for Korra later on, and Korra didn't feed her, and Naga was very upset with Korra.
Yeah, no, I definitely sort of get that sort of idea here. I mean, I guess this is where it would have all sort of started from this first food that she gave Naga when they first met. So it's kind of neat to sort of think about that and see if that's actually how it was sort of set up
And I suppose it may be a slight reference to the fact that, how Aang and Appa first met was
with the apple.
Aang offering food to Appa, the animal who'd eventually become his animal guide. But yeah, it's just a really nice scene. And just we turn to the next page, and Korra tries to kind of console the lost pup by saying, "But don't fear. Luckily for you, I can save us because I'm the Avatar." And she uses some water bending. It looks amazing as you kind of go montage panel by panel. She's doing some like punch to the air, double fist thing like she did earlier on, and then she does this like water bending kick, and we cut to the result panel, and she's made somewhat of a kind of snow kind of igloo cave thing, but it's not very good looking. It'll just about do for the two of them, and you can see that Naga is not exactly like impressed with it. And Korra's just like, "Come on, follow me in," and they both go in. So, what are your thoughts on I don't know, like what the count is on Korra having these "I'm the Avatar" moments, but this must be like three or four at least.
Yeah, no, this is kind of fun. It's just funny how it seems like she's doing something so massive just to make this sort of little sort of igloo, and I guess that sort of just keys you into her her initial sort of not really being super, I guess, good at waterbending. Yes, she's just sort of learning, so she has to use all of these sort of over exaggerated movements where you probably could have done it a lot simpler if you knew the actual sort of right sort of waterbending sort of techniques as we've seen her use later on. But no, it's definitely a sort of a fun little scene to see this igloo being built and Naga, having the little question mark above her head, sort of, wondering what this thing is that her new friend has actually made. So it's a fun, nice scene.
Yeah, like you just get the impression from this page that Korra considers the position of Avatar as basically like being a superhero kind of type thing, more so than like this job that has like a ton of responsibilities to it. She's just like, when you're the Avatar, you do stuff like this all the time. You make igloos to save pets and stuff like that. Um, but in the next page, there's the inside this kind of snow shelter, I suppose. And Core's just like, "Brr," obviously the cold sound effect. "I know what'll warm us up, a little fire." And then she tries to basically, I suppose what she's trying to do is just create a small but controlled flame that she can kind of hold in her hand. But she accidentally, I suppose, turns it more into a small fire blast that kind of gets a little bit out of control, scares Naga, scares Korra, and she kind of is kind of knocked back by this, and that she definitely doesn't have control over firebending right now. And she says, "Sorry, I'm not a very good firebender yet. Master Katara says I have to get good at waterbending before I can learn the other elements. I thought being the Avatar was going to be fun, but it's just a bunch of rules." And we see that kind of Korra is snapped out a little bit of this kind of, slightly more serious moment by Naga licking her on the hand, and Korra's just like, "Haha, that tickles." This is definitely the most, I suppose, serious moment in the book. That gives you a hint as opposed to what Korra's issue overall will be with her training. But what were your thoughts on them in any way, I suppose, addressing this with a very young Korra here?
I thought this was done pretty well. I mean, it's nice to see that, even at a young age, Korra has, the ability to sort of reflect on her new sort of position here, and that she realizes that, even in the scene before we were saying that, Korra seems like this is, sort of like a fun sort of job, but here you can see here that she sort of, I don't know, has at least a little bit sense of sort of the position that she's actually in. So it's nice to see that sort of contrast here, and just it's interesting just to see a point where Korra doesn't have I guess sort of full mastery over her sort of firebending, because I guess if this is right after Dave sort of discovered her, we did see her do an initial sort of fire blast when she was showing off to the White Lotus that she was sort of the Avatar. So here we can see again that she just doesn't have sort of defined control yet of her of all of her abilities, which is just something that she'll have to learn over time. So it's nice to see how they set that up.
Yeah, it's interesting in that, like, we obviously commented earlier on about the fact that, like, it's very early in her training. There doesn't seem like there would be a lot of rules, but I suppose for Korra right now, the key thing is that, like, she knows she can actually, like, use three of the elements, but she's kind of right now kind of being forced to only focus on one of them, and she knows that she's not going to be able to in any way, like, address the other two for a long time, and you definitely I think get the idea that she'd kind of prefer to do firebending first if possible because it kind of suits her, or even earthbending as kind of seems to be like her general style of waterbending. So I think that the rule is probably that she's annoyed with right now is just which element she has to learn right now, and that waterbending, Korra doesn't have a typical waterbender personality in that, yes, she's family focused, but beyond that, she doesn't have the kind of flowing personality that like a typical waterbender would have. So firebending, earthbending seems more suited to her, but definitely right now for a very young Korra, it's she's prioritizing she wants it to be fun more so than rules and the seriousness of the situation. But we move on and we see that I suppose the next morning, Tonrock, Senna, and Katara are out looking for Korra. They're kind of screaming her name. Tonrock says, "Korra, are you out here?" Senna says, "Tonrock, over there. Doesn't that mound of snow look like someone water bent it?" And Tonrock comes over, uses his own water bending, gets a lot of snow out of the way and finds basically Korra and Naga kind of snuggled up right next to each other. That they've clearly gotten cold over the night and had kind of snuggled together for warmth to kind of survive the night together. And they're all shocked by this. And Korra just says, "Mommy, Daddy, you found me." Dot dot dot. So yeah, they very quickly we transition from just they kind of, I suppose, go to sleep and they're found the next morning. It's not meant to be a huge issue, but for a very young Korra, this is like her first big adventure, I suppose.
Yeah, no, this is it's nice how they sort of set this up, how it's just, sort of they just sort of recognize that there's just this mound of snow. It's not even like an actual sort of like igloo or anything. It's just like a little bump on the ground that looks like it might have actually been bent. So it's interesting to see that, I guess, sort of Senna was the one that actually sort of noticed that. But it's definitely sort of a cute scene just to see them both sort of huddled up there together and to see that they're fine, that they used each other's sort of warmth to actually sort of survive the night as you would.
Yeah, the only thing here is, I suppose, just that Senna's the one to discover it, but then Tonrock's the one who goes over and waterbends it. Like they still for some reason don't want to show Senna waterbending, even though, as far as we're aware, it's canon that she is a waterbender from the Nickelodeon website. But they just don't seem to want to do that. But anyway, yeah, very nice scene as they find her. Uh, Next page immediately follows this. Tonrock says, "Korra, get out of there. Do you know how worried we were?" Senna says, "I can't believe you spent the night in a storm all alone." And Korra says, "I wasn't alone." And she introduces everyone to Naga was with me, is what she says. So she's named the dog overnight. Um, and they're all like, "Naga, you've named this pup." And we see it's a very happy Naga, just like tail flapping, she's woofing. And Korra explains that that's what I named her. She lost her pack. She needs a new family now. Can I keep her? And you get this very funny moment as just you get the kind of funny, kind of exaggerated eyes from Tonrock and Senna as they just kind of stare at each other like, what is she asking us? And they just say, at the same time, they basically say, ask your mother, ask your father. They just putting this off on the other one, and neither of them have an answer. And then Katara takes the two parents aside and is just like, all avatars have had animal guides in the past. Perhaps Korra has discovered hers. And Naga might just be what a high energy girl like Korra needs. And Tonrock is just like, I suppose, dot, dot, dot. So, this is how she convinces them to allow Korra to keep Nagas. But what are your thoughts on this page? This is a fairly important one.
Yeah, no, I thought this was really nice. It's really cool just to see, Korra just thought up this name sort of overnight out of nowhere. I wonder if it has any sort of extra sort of meaning to it or any other reference. But no, it's definitely nice. It's nice to see just the parents, sort of, not knowing what to do in this situation. And it's, it's fun to see that Katara was, it makes sense that Katara would be the one to sort of, be the one who would give sort of the sage advice as far as, letting Korra sort of keep Naga as her sort of animal guide. And since that's what, avatars usually always have, it sort of just happens to work out that way. So it's nice to see, that sort of, how they sort of let that actually happen to be.
Yeah, this is a really nice page. I like the bolded emphasis on the new family part here. It's Korra showing that she is indeed from the Water Tribe. The focus on that even though Korra is very young here, she realizes that like Naga kind of I suppose should be with her own pack. She needs to have a family with her to kind of grow up with. But now, they've had this experience together where they've both been young and lost together. So Korra's like she needs a new family now. We can be that to her. I can look after her, and it's just a nice moment where Korra, I suppose you, given like what's about to happen and that she's going to be confined in the compound for a while, this is exactly kind of what she needs. And Katara's explanation here is quite nice. The Korra's high energy, looking after a polar bear dog, which is a wild animal, which is going to be tame now because of the friendship with Korra. That dog's going to keep her energy, keep her from running out in the middle of the night, just looking after her. So that's really nice. And then the mention of animal guides again is interesting in that um, do they even mention animal guides in Avatar: The Last Airbender, the show? I don't really remember them doing that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I feel like they
Like
would have had to at least once, but
um, yeah, it's a weird one in that it's something I think most fans know, like Avatar Animal Guide, spirit animal type thing. But I don't really remember which scenes it's really covered in, and that it just seems to be something that like everyone knows about, but like we're not exactly sure where it came from, and that like we saw the moment when Appa and Aang met. We know how close Roku and Fang were in that. The fact that Fang is a spirit animal when we like
mm,
when Aang meets him, shows you the closeness of the two. Um, but I don't really remember like when it was brought up that like this is a thing with all avatars that they have an animal companion. We obviously know that it kind of dates back to Wan with Mula, and do we know for sure if that's like the animal is a reincarnation cycle like the avatar? We're not really sure, but it would be cool if it was. But do you have any further thoughts on the whole animal guide thing?
yeah, no, I think it's definitely sort of interesting. I wonder if, I mean, we always, keep them in order as far as, which avatar had which animal guide and so on and so on. So I don't know. That is definitely an interesting sort of idea to keep in mind.
But yeah, just one final page, and it's kind of like it's 5 panels. It's kind of basically a montage of just Korra and Naga growing up together from here on out. And the top panel is basically we assume set like the following day. Basically, it's Korra and Naga running around the house, and Tonrock and Senna basically saying they'll tire. Tonrock says they'll tire out sooner or later, and Senna says, "You sure about that?" And they're really like out of energy into themselves, trying to keep everything tidy as they're kind of wrecking the place. We could, I assume, a year or two later, and it's like 7, 8 year old Korra on a much bigger Naga now, sliding down a kind of snow embankment. Then we could another 2 or 3 years later, and it looks to be like a 10, 12, 13-year-old Korra jumping Naga over a fence in a much bigger Avatar compound. You can see that kind of get bigger in the background as well. Then we cut to a scene from K101, Welcome to Republic City, of obviously Korra on Naga kind of riding across the tundra when she's allowed outside. And then we cut to a book four scene of obviously Korra in her new kind of end of book four outfit with Naga kind of just on Air Temple Island running around, friendly. They're all grown up now. It's a really nice page. Just getting to see Korra at least two different stages in her life that we've never seen her at. Two different outfits as well, and to see the Avatar compound grow up. get bigger panel to panel and reference the first episode, reference the last episode of Korra. It's really nice to show just the connection between these two. But what are your thoughts on this last page?
Yeah, no, I agree. The connection between the two of them, it can clearly be seen in these sort of panels here, and it's interesting just to see the progression of Korra and Naga and just sort of whole overall sort of compound. It's nice to see, the parts of it that we didn't actually get to see, how it's actually sort of built up all around sort of Korra over the years. So it's nice to see that sort of progression here. So I think they did a really good job of just, this being sort of the ending page and us, sort of coming to a close on the story of how Korra sort of met Naga and just, their how they both, really sort of suit each other as far as, their mentalities and their energy, their high energy at that.
Hmm. Yeah, that last page really kind of, I suppose, highlights why the story is called Friends for Life, and that those 5 panels, just on their own, that last page kind of covers why they are friends for life. The closeness of an avatar and their animal guide. It's really nice. I suppose my kind of final thoughts are just that it's a really nice 10-page comic. It tells the story it needs to, how Korra and Naga met. Uh, Gives you a little insight into a couple of other things like Korra's relationship with her parents at this point in time, Katara's involvement early on in Korra's training, and just little things like that. The compound as it kind of grows over time. I think especially how at least the Southerners think of polar bear dogs in general, that they're kind of dangerous animals, and just very much a nice exploration of a much younger Korra. But what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it works really well as sort of this 10-page sort of comic that has a self sort of contained story. I mean, I think it's something that, like we sort of have said, and didn't really need such a longer story that it would have, taken like a full comic or what we normally get or even half of that. So I think it works really well. The art is really nice. I think, overall I like it. This is probably one of my favorite sort of artists overall. I think it really fits the style of the show, and while being, a bit sort of different as well, since it is sort of still images, but it still feels like it could actually be part of the show and could be animated in some form. So I really sort of enjoyed this comic.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I forgot to completely talk about the art. Yeah, Heather Campbell, new to at least Korra comics officially here. I really like the art overall. I like a lot of the free comics. It's a different style. This one definitely feels kind of very close to the animation style and really fits. This is, I think, in general from like other fan reaction around the place. People really like
Hmm.
this style, and would if Brittany Williams, as kind of is rumored, can't continue on with the main core project, Heather Campbell is definitely someone I think a lot of people would like to see take over that role, because this in general is really nice. There's a couple of just I think really nice looking panels here. I think I think the whole first page is actually like really nice looking. Um, Actually, all of the images on page 3, the page with no dialogue, is really good. Especially the third panel with Korra just peeking out the door is very clean. If I had any negatives about the art, it would be that at times some of the panels aren't as clean as others, and that some of the line art can be a little bit messy, in that there are times when it's like super clean and the curves for like curved surfaces are like very clean and curved. There are other times when it's like 5 or 6 like different changes in angle to do a curve instead of just a kind of actual curve. Um, but for the most part, I do like it. It is definitely one of those things where like if they were on a full on comic and had like I suppose a proper schedule and stuff like that for doing this, just it might be a little bit more consistent. But I suppose what are some of your more, I suppose, in-depth thoughts on the art?
Overall, I think it's pretty good. I mean, I think for the most part, most of the shading and sort of lighting of the various scenes sort of fits in the mode of, sort of either the tundra or sort of inside of the house with, I guess maybe sort of like a fire going. For me, most of the line art is, pretty good. I mean, I think some parts they did, sort of a different sort of take on the actual line art. Like I think probably the part where she's in the bed looks looks probably the most different to me as far as it being, I guess, more sort of cartoony, but it's still, overall all the line art sort of fits together, together pretty well.
Yeah, like I think for me the main thing that looks different is like almost like compare the first panel to the last panel in the comic. The first one is like super clean, and the line art is very just much just to get everything across on the page. Whereas in the last panel, you can see especially on like Naga, there's a lot of little extra lines all around the place to get the various kind of I suppose definition of like Naga's legs, and it's not as smooth. Obviously the images are slightly different sizes. I think it's easier to see in the middle panel on the last page. There's a lot of kind of potentially like unnecessary kind of line art at times like around the tail area, the paws, but I think for the most part this is really good art. Probably the best, my favorite of the art styles for the four free comics we've had so far. But I suppose where does it rank for you? I suppose just in terms of art style against the other free comics.
This is probably for me. It's probably at the top. I think I like this one the most just because it seems to fit in mode with the show overall so well.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And yeah, I suppose the final thing I'll say is just this is again something I mentioned in my written review and video review on YouTube. Just that this was really cool to get like a further insight into Korra's life when she was young. I now kind of need like a full-on story of like her kind of entire life training. Like I want to see her like her take the water bending test in the same way she took the fire bending test, transition from water to the next element, and see who her like mentor is at like earth bending and so on, and see when exactly like the Red Lotus kidnap attempt takes place, and how Korra feels about like it's clear that she would probably, I think, to some extent sense that something bad happened, but like no one's telling her what happened, and how things change after that. There's a lot more rules than even there were before.
Mm.
I just think there's so much to cover in Korra's training that I'd just like a little mini series to focus on it. Like this was a really good insight, and I think like if this was say like issue one of like the Korra training mini series, like I think you could tell most of the important parts of this story in like uh 3-4 issues, like 30, 40, maybe 50 pages. And I hope it's something that like they perhaps look into, like just doing more stories like this, filling in bits of the universe where we know little things but don't know everything. In that, like we still don't really know who her like earthbending teacher was and stuff like that. Like we assume it's just one of the White Lotus members, but it'd still be cool to see how she reacts to like whoever her teacher is, and just little things like when does Tenzin first come to see her, and like at what age was Korra when Tenzin first met her, and so on, that sort of thing. But I suppose what are your thoughts on like stuff like that? Did reading this comic get you like excited and like thinking about like her whole journey of training and stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I definitely thought of, I don't know, it seemed interesting just how they sort of, how I guess sort of informal the training is now versus what we saw in the show when they had the whole compound and they had all the masters and the White Lotus people sort of looking on. I think it would be interesting to see sort of like the progression of that, how it goes from just Katara teaching Korra water bending to the other sort of masters coming, and sort of how Korra sort of views that. I mean, we can see from I guess sort of the last page that she still was able to have fun throughout her sort of time in the compound, but it would be interesting to see sort of, I guess sort of the more strict parts, or the more, the rules that she sort of mentions before, as far as her training goes.
hmm But yeah, that's our review there for the Korra 2016 free comic Friends for Life. I suppose one final thing would just be that it was really interesting that like things played out as they have, and that like we knew that this was going to be the first Korra comic, but I think by now we maybe had expected that we'd know a little bit more about the full on Korra comic series that's supposedly coming fall 2016, late 2016, whenever. Um, the advertisements in the actual physical copy after this only really cover the Avatar comics. They don't. There's no mention of the fact that there are Korra comics coming. There is a Korra advertisement page, but it's just advertising the four art books that Dark Horse have. So it's kind of interesting that like this comic has a really good appeal to like kids to get into Avatar comics, but there are no comics focusing on Korra right now. And I suppose maybe it will get people into the show, and by the time they're done with the show, the comics will be out. But it was weird, and I can't see that they had necessarily have this planned this way from the beginning. Like, do you think this was always going to be the case where like they knew there wouldn't be news about the full on core comic out by the time the free comic came out, or do you think there has been delays, like big delays, potential problems with the full on core comics?
I don't know if there has been sort of big delays. I mean, I don't know. Usually they're pretty good about saying something if there has been sort of a major sort of issue, maybe just, the typical slowdown they might not actually sort of say something about. But it doesn't seem like they planned, for any of that to sort of be mentioned in this comic. Maybe just because they just didn't know where they would be at with the actual other comics to even sort of, think if they should actually even have it in this at this point in time, especially since we know that this was sort of printed quite a bit ago, since we do know some people sort of got it already. So maybe they thought just it would have been better not to actually include any information about that comic in this one.
Yeah, it's just interesting that like we have this now, but we're not going to have any information about proper core comics for another like 2.5 months realistically, because Comic Con's in late July basically. So we're gonna have a long time to wait, and then even then the comics are gonna focus on like older Korra and that sort of thing. But yeah, we'll move on away from this free comic book review, and we'll get into listener questions. There are multiple ways to send in questions if you have any yourself. Easiest way is the email address avataronlinepodcast@gmail.com. And we have two Tumblr pages you can send questions into. Ask boxes are open. They are avataronlinepodcast.tumblr.com and avatarthelastairbender.online.tumblr.com. Final way to send questions in is if you are a member on the site's forums, avatarthelastairbender.online.com. You can post questions in the podcast forum section. We have a thread there for podcast listener questions, and we take them from there. But there are the various ways you can do it. We have two questions this week. First one is from an anonymous on Tumblr. And the question is, to you, what is the most frustrating thing about the fandom, or thing that the fandom tend to agree with or say? So I think we've had similar questions like this before in the past, perhaps not worded exactly like this. But I suppose, Greg, what's your answer to this? Like, is there anything the fandom kind of does, says, opinion that tends to be out there on the internet that you don't quite agree with, that kind of frustrates you when you see it too often?
I'm trying to think. I mean, we have had a similar question like this before. I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe sometimes. I don't know. I guess really not overall anything specifically, but I guess just when certain things are sort of, I guess, sort of blown out of proportions, or there's sort of a real huge sort of, I guess, sort of stink up either on either, I guess, certain characters or maybe some sort of relationships. Shipping is always sort of a big thing. Usually when those things sort of garner sort of like a larger sort of attention than they really sort of need to, that can sort of annoy me at sometimes, but. I mean, that would probably be sort of my main sort of, I guess, pet peeve. Either that or just, I don't know, maybe sometimes just how the movie is always sort of mentioned in, as far as just being, sort of the worst thing sort of ever, which, I'm definitely not sort of happy with that at all. But I think maybe sometimes that sort of gets blown over and over, beat to death sometimes as well. It's probably those two things for me.
Yeah, like for me, the movie is definitely one of them. It's for me the general like way that a lot of the fandom kind of approach discussing the movie tends to be very focused on like being super negative, like that the movie could not be mentioned at all in the fandom for months, but like suddenly Nickelodeon is showing the Last Airbender movie again, like one of their movies that they have that they would show on their channel from time to time, and people start freaking out, like, why are Nickelodeon showing this awful movie? And suddenly everyone who hasn't talked about the movie in months comes back and is just like, kind of says their piece again, like, I hate the movie, M. Night Shyamalan is an idiot, and all of this stuff comes back out, and it just kind of goes away and then comes back the next time the movie happens to come into the spotlight, whether it be a rumor about The Last Airbender 2 being in production or whatever. And it's weird because it's one of those things where like the people who hate the movie the most are kind of come across as the most obsessed with the movie, like that if you really don't like it that much, like stop talking about it. Like the reason it won't be forgotten is because people just can't not be negative towards the movie when it comes up. And um, as someone who's like obviously on past podcasts and listener questions and stuff like that, uh, as someone who can like talk about the movie in depth because I don't mind talking about it, I don't hate the movie. Um, it's interesting to see how like there are times where like I bring up a point like fairly recently on Reddit. There was a there was a kind of post about like what do you hate about the Last Airbender movie, and someone replied like with the whole idea of like I hate the way the Fire Nation are done in the movie because firebending in the movie verse is done in such a way where the firebenders need a source to use firebending, they can't create it themselves. And my response to that was that like uh in for me the I treat the movie as like a separate universe. It doesn't It's based on the show, but it really doesn't have much of an impact on it for the most part. And its different approach to firebending is interesting in its own way. Like of course, like why change it, but it did, and it's interesting in that like the special ability of Sozin's Comet in the movieverse is actually that it grants firebenders the ability to create fire themselves. What makes Iroh unique is not lightning bending in the movie, it's that even without Sozin's Comet he can create fire himself. And you know continuing that speculation forward, like there's this idea that, oh, if the movies had continued, Iroh would have taught Zuko how to create fire himself. And some of the more thematic stuff that they do in the movie with that, the Fire Nation being very kind of industry focused, the machines being a big thing. Um, that's kind of the reason why they have such an advantage in that they use their machines to make up for their advantage with their firebending and stuff like that. And I post all that like a really thought out response, and it's just like instantly downvoted, and it's just like, oh, why do they even bother? Kind of really reasonable point, but no, I forget that the fandom just hates the movie. And it's one of the things like I'd always say to people, check out the podcast review special that we did for the Last Airbender movie. um, I think the crew for that podcast was myself, Rich, Callum, and Kelly. And I think the way it generally worked out was that I was like slightly positive on the movie. Like that was kind of the position I was taking. That like I don't hate the movie, I don't like love it, I enjoy it when I watch it. Callum was like flat out like completely neutral, just like I don't care enough to dislike it or like it. Like I don't really care. And then Rich and Kelly were like very negative. And what I found interesting about that podcast, going back to it, is that like um the we all agreed in like the discussion in the lead into that podcast that everyone would make positives and negatives for the movie. So that way the people who are super negative would have to talk about the points that they actually liked, and myself and Callum, who were a bit more positive, had to come up with negatives. And what was interesting was when we came around to it, I actually disagreed with some of the positives that like Kelly and Rich had with the movie, and they actually disagreed with some of my negatives. So it was actually an interesting discussion because we like agreed to not be like super angry, and that like the movie can actually be a good topic when you actually get into it. It's just no one ever gives it a chance within the fandom. Um, But yeah, I suppose. Did you have any further thoughts on, I suppose, the general way the fandom treats the movie?
No, no. I mean, I think you pretty much got it there. It's just it's something that if it's mentioned, it's usually mentioned in a very sort of harsh and negative sort of light, without any sort of, I guess, sort of option for discussion. Which I mean, I'm definitely more on sort of the negative side of the movie overall, but I don't really care to just generally say anything about it in general and period. I
Yeah.
just let it be.
Mm, indeed. The other one that slightly annoys me, obviously, is that I'm probably known the podcast as being a huge like book two supporter. It's like my favorite book. I tend to get frustrated when people are like overly negative towards book two because oftentimes it comes from a place where perhaps they've only watched the book once and didn't like, because they perhaps had a slightly more negative view on it, didn't like take everything in and really like connect it all together and stuff like that. So um a lot of people tend to be like confused and like point out that there's a bunch of plot holes in like book two. And again, another thing on Reddit that came up was just like, it's like, am I the only one who like really like thinks that the end of book two is like really bad, was like one of the threads on Reddit recently. And they made a couple of points and I'm just kind of like, wow, that like all of this stuff is like 100% like explained in the show. Like, did you really miss this? And like I suppose some of the points that came up were like, why did Korra go into the spirit world to close the southern portal if she knew like that it, I suppose, knowing that Vatu could only escape if both portals were open. And like the explanation is obviously, like everyone knows, is that they only found out that Vatu can't break free unless both are open afterwards, because Janora reads it in Wan Shi library, in combination with the fact that the last time Unalaq and Korra met, Unalaq told her, it's actually in one of the episodes we reviewed recently, Unalaq specifically tells her that I don't need you to open the portal, though he doesn't explain why, and we find out that it's a lie. Um, and then like a bunch of other stuff. The person got a little bit nitpicky and was like, why would they even decide to attack the southern portal when Republic City is so much closer to the northern portal? And again, it's one of those things where like I think you got a little bit lost in the fact that you dislike book two and ignored a little bit of the logic of the Avatar world, in that end of book one water, they established that the reason the North is still the Northern Water Tribe is still exists in a very prevalent way is because it's really difficult to attack it because of the giant ice field in front of it. Hence why Zhao was like the first person to attack it basically in the whole war. Um, that plus, I think everyone forgot the line that Senna actually called Korra and told her that her father had been kidnapped. That's why they went to the south. Like it's little things like that, like people taking a negative kind of view on things, but then not having all the details to like actually like make it come across. Like I have my own negatives with book two. It's just I think at times people can get a little bit like that with some of the things. Um, but yeah, the next question is from sometimes guest host on the podcast, Lauren. And the question is, if you guys wrote your own Lost Adventures for The Legend of Korra, what would the stories be about? For anyone unaware of what this is referencing, The Lost Adventures is the first ever Avatar comic to come out from Dark Horse. It's a collection of shorter comic stories, very similar actually to the Free Comic Book Day stories, but they vary in length a lot more. All of the free comics are about 10 pages, whereas The Lost Adventures had a couple of stories that were only like 2 or 3 pages long. It had one or two that were like 20 plus pages long, but in general, they were like all closer to like 5 or 6 pages long, and it's about 30 something little stories set in between the episodes of Avatar. So this question is basically, if we had a chance to write our own like series of little stories that we don't know about for Korra, what are some of our ideas for that? So I suppose, Greg, what's the most obvious kind of an idea for a Lost Adventure story that comes to mind for
I
you?
don't know. That's a good question. I was just trying to think of a whole bunch of them really quickly. I guess we sort of already mentioned some with Korra and her training. Those could all be sort of little adventures. But I guess sort of dealing with some of the other characters. I don't know. One that popped in my head would just be Bolin sort of training lava bending, just sort of how that sort of would work and sort of how he would get a mastery over that. I guess another one I was thinking of randomly, and this probably maybe wouldn't even be sort of like a action focused one, would just be Asami and her actually sort of running the actual sort of company, at whatever sort of point in sort of the story overall. I think that would be interesting just to see how it functions, I guess, sort of post her dad and everything that happened there. And I don't know, I feel like there could be a whole bunch of them with sort of Korra, but with her being sort of the main story, other than stuff from her past, I don't think we might need as many as far as her, in the time that we currently see in the show. But I mean, I think Mako could definitely have some interesting ones too, as well. I mean, we've seen one of his sort of stories of his where he's doing sort of the police sort of detective work. But I think there could possibly be some more stories around that that could be interesting to sort of explore.
Yeah, I think the most obvious place is that there's a 3 year time skip between book 3 and 4, where 3 years is a long time. Like that's like the biggest kind of time skip we've had in Avatar. Um, Obviously for Korra, it's a lot of recovery and stuff like that, and I think there's potential still for like one or two notable things to have like happened with her, with regards to her finally like bending, I suppose maybe for the first time in a while, or something like that. Um, but especially focusing on what her friends were doing during that 3 year time skip, like halfway through that, like what was Mako doing, what was Asami doing, like what was Mako's most interesting case during the time. I think that would be a nice one, just to get a little detective story. Um, Bolin seemed to like not be with Kuvira too long. So like before that, what was he doing? Like until like he was like brought on board with Kuvira and Varric. And then like there's potential for like funnier stories about like what was Sparkly Sparkly Bushman, whose name I kind of forget.
Gamu?
Yes, Gamu, that's it. Yeah, what he was doing. He had his own kind of like underground group of people who were like super friendly to each other. Like, what were they doing during all of this like crazy spirit stuff happening overhead and that sort of thing? Like, there's a ton of potential with some of the minor characters, and then like go into like backstory for characters, like what's a thing that happened to General Iroh. Focus on the time when like Zuko found out about what happened to Iroh, or like what Iroh did to go into the spirit world when he died. Little things like that. And then like touching on like the older ATLA cast, like there's a ton of stuff about them, like Sokka. Just anything with Sokka would be nice to get.
Yeah.
Um, Suki, I think just flat out we need to see her do something and see what's going on there, and just various little things like that. I'd like a little flashback story with Tonrock and Senna. Maybe they tell Korra how they first met or something like that. I'd really like that, just to further add to that Tonrock backstory, and so on. But I think there's a ton of potential for Lost Adventures stories with Korra. Whether or not they'll do it or not, I'm not entirely sure. And that it now would probably be a lot of organizing to get that many artists and writers on board. But I'd hope at some point that we do get more chance for stories like that. Because I think this universe is very much the sort of universe where those kind of like omnibus collections of just stories from various points in time work super well. That's why the free comics are all so interesting. Just getting those little stories, but the depth in them as well. But any more ideas come to mind for you, Greg?
No, I think the ones that you mentioned were actually pretty cool. I mean, the whole gap. I mean, that's there's a whole bunch that could be done there. But I don't know. I think any sort of little stories with our characters. There's a lot that we don't sort of know about them, and even some earlier stories. I guess we have one for Mako and Bolin, but it'd be nice to get some earlier stories for Asami too. That could be interesting to see what life was like for her growing up.
Yeah, and then the sort of stories that just doesn't seem like they ever will tell, but like I think the fans would really like to see it. Like how like do Aang and Katara react to like the birth of their first child and stuff like that. See them as like early parents. They're the sort of things we'd like to see. The Katang wedding, those type of moments. Just like sure, it'll be like the most fan servicey thing ever in terms of like it's exactly what we want, but like just give us something like that because like to some extent this Korra Naga story is kind of exactly like a sort of fan servicey story. Like it's cute, there's only a little bit of seriousness to it, but it's exactly what we wanted, and it's kind of like perfect. Everyone, there's been no complaints about Friends for Life that I've seen online.
Mhm.
It's kind of perfect to people, and more stories I think like that. Just like what was the wedding day like for Aang Katara? It'd be cool just to see like Sokka as like the best man or whatever, and just these funny moments that happen during it. But yeah, definitely we need more stuff like that. But yeah, that's basically the end of the podcast. Shorter one this week. But again, there's not a lot of news recently. And realistically, the only news that we're going to get in the next coming weeks is going to be news about when we will get news at San Diego Comic Con. Like it's the schedule starting to come into play for that. As we're primarily finding out if we're going to get an Avatar panel or if Avatar is just going to be covered in the Dark Horse panel is going to be the big thing. Like if it gets its own panel, we know it's probably going to be a really big reveal, kind of blowout. They're properly going to talk about it. If it's just in the Dark Horse panel, it could just be a fairly standard comic announcement. But definitely something to look out for as we're two and a bit months away from Comic Con. Don't think we'll, based on previous years, when do we start to get news about the panel? I think it's only like about a month beforehand, so it's still
Yeah.
probably be a month before we start to really hear anything. So yeah, not a lot really going to happen recently, but the next week, obviously, we're going back to the Movers podcast. We're still trying to figure out if Kelly can be on the next show and like what her next pick will be. It'll either be Kelly's choice or the my next pick, which will be for the anime Bleach, and we'll review the first two episodes of that. But in 2 weeks' time from now, we'll go back to the Avatar podcast and we'll do Avatar Online podcast episode 132, where we'll return to our kind of random Korra rewatch. I also had the next pick for that, and I had to choose from book one, and the episode I chose was season one, episode 11, Skeletons in the Closet. So in 2 weeks' time, that's the episode we're going to be reviewing. But yeah, that's the general schedule for the podcast. That's been episode 131 for the free comic review, Friends for Life. It's been myself, Morgan, and Greg. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and bye.
Bye bye.